Well, we're getting into chapter 7 today, and if you've got your books, I'd like for you to open your books to chapter 7. I want to go over some of the information that's here. We're going to hit on just a couple of things here. I'm going to look at some of the time periods, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on these, but I also want to look at some of the characteristics of the inmates we're seeing come into the prison system. I want to look at the classification systems real briefly. You've actually got an assignment that's going to cover this. And I want to look at prison work programs, kind of educational programs, things that we're doing to rehabilitate offenders when they come into the system and prepare them for the job market potentially on the outside. We'll mention that briefly and we'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of it as well. First thing, turn in your book to where it talks about the stages of prison history in the United States. And if you've got the 7th edition of the text, that is a chart that is covered on page 213. If you've got a later edition, it may be on a different page. The thing that I want to show you here is look at the goals and look at this chart that's here. What you're going to see is that the goals of the prison system consistently change based upon what society wants it to do. So if we go back into the penitentiary era in the 1790s and 1825, this was very much rehabilitation and deterrence. And I want to talk about this for just a second. There were two major thoughts that occurred during this time period, and we actually call them the Auburn Penitentiary and the Pennsylvania system. I'll talk briefly about the Pennsylvania system first. It was actually developed by the Quakers. And the Quakers believed in reformation and rehabilitation through a oneness with God. And so their basic philosophy was to isolate the person from the evil influences of society, and the way we rehabilitated them was through a solitary confinement. They were allowed to work in their jail cells, but they were alone, and they typically stayed by themselves for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They could not converse with other inmates. They could have religious literature, they could read their Bibles, they could study, they had jobs that they could do, but everything was typically confined within the cell. They also built these prisons in remote locations, and we still do this today. They built them away from society and away from civilization because the thought was that it's civilization that is corrupting these individuals, and so in order to help them get right with God, we need to isolate them from society. At the same time, we had what was called the Auburn system. The Auburn penitentiary system was somewhat similar, but it was more militaristic in nature. Another difference of it was that while they did have the segregated concept in the Auburn system, they were eventually, the inmates were allowed to talk with one another and were allowed to congregate, but it was much more militaristic, regimented style. So that's kind of the beginning of the system itself. But I want you to notice when you look into the current state of the system, which is the just desserts era, we're essentially punishing them in the same way. It may not be a rehabilitation, but what we're doing is we're punishing them based upon retribution and just desserts. And if you look in between there, you'll see that we bounce back and forth between these different goals. Like I said, based upon what society actually views as important and how we should be treating these individuals. The second thing I want to look at, and your book actually has this as well, when we start looking at the characteristics of inmates that come into the system. And again, there is an assignment in this module that's going to cover this. But if you look at the chart in your book, it's actually very similar to what we see with jails. The prison system is comprised mostly of males. About 90% of the inmates in the prison system are males. We have an overrepresentation of African Americans and minorities in general. We see the age differences that are here. So what we see is, even though jails are a little bit more pronounced, we still see those same characteristics that are occurring in the jail inmates also occurring in the prison inmates as well. Like I said, the overrepresentation of minorities, we see the violent offenses, the number of violent offenses occurring, and men. We are by far the most popular gender that is in the prison system. This leads also into what we call classification. And again, there is an assignment that is going to be based upon this. How do we classify inmates, and how do we know what prison system, or what prison I should say, to put them in? The state of North Carolina and every prison system has an inmate classification system, and I'm going to briefly talk about how North Carolina's works. Once we have an inmate that is sentenced to prison, they go to a facility that basically does a diagnostic on them. And it goes through background, psychological, medical workup on these inmates, and what they try to do is place the inmate in a facility that has programs or has the ability to be able to treat the individual to the best of our possibility. And then the hope is that we send them to that facility and that they can somewhat be rehabilitated there. And I use the reason somewhat because keep in mind, we are still a structured sentencing state. So even though rehabilitation may be built in there as far as the programs go, we're still going to hold the individual accountable for their actions, and we're going to keep them in prison until they do their time. So we not only look at what prison to send them to, but we also look at the classification. Are they closed custody? Are they medium custody? Are they minimum custody? And they can work their way down. So if you got an individual who commits a homicide, for example, they can work their way down to a minimum security camp. We have a minimum security camp here in Randolph County in Asheboro. We have murderers, rapists, and robbers who are housed here, but because of their good behavior, they've been able to work themselves down to a privilege, which is being in a minimum security camp. The other thing that I want to mention is what we call prison work, and this is probably one of the more debated issues that we see in institutions. I'm going to have you look at what's called correction enterprises, and the websites are linked in the modules. Should inmates be allowed to produce things in their cells? Should companies be allowed to come in and hire inmate labor? The advantage to it is that we're actually training these individuals to be able to have production jobs once they come out. The disadvantage is we're taking those jobs away from civilians who are on the outside world. And by the way, when you look at the corrections enterprises, you're going to see that they make a ton of stuff for the state of North Carolina in the prison system. There's even a meat processing plant in Lillington that produces meat products for the prison system. And what about education? Should inmates receive free education? A lot of the community colleges teach GED classes and college courses in the prison system. The proponents of it say, well, yeah, because we want those people to have an education when they come out. But those who disagree say, well, wait a minute, we're the taxpayers. We should reap the benefits. If the state gives a free education, it should be to the taxpayers, not for those that are living off the prison system. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in this chapter. If you've got any questions, please post them to the Q&A forum, or you can always email me.